Charleston's earliest auction records, preserved with almost obsessive precision by generations of archivists, contain a single anomaly that continues to cast a long, unsettling shadow over the city's past. In 1891, when archivists reorganized municipal documents for public access, they deliberately removed a set of pages from the Ryan's Mart slave auction ledgers, pages so contradictory, so impossible, that their very existence threatened the integrity of the historical archive. Among thousands of sales recorded with flawless bookkeeping, one series of transactions stood apart, an aberration that defied both logic and precedent. According to the ledgers, a single woman was sold 17 different times to 17 different buyers in the span of just 8 months in 1844. Each buyer was a prominent member of Charleston's elite, each sale commanded a higher price than the last, and each record identified the woman in exactly the same terms, the same age, the same skills, the same bearing, and a distinctive triangular birthmark, described so precisely that no clerical explanation could account for the repetition. At first glance, the entries seemed like duplicates, perhaps a copying error or the repeated use of the same physical description for different individuals. But a deeper examination revealed meticulous signatures, notarized documents, buyer names, transport records, and dates that aligned with disturbing clarity. These were not duplicates. They were transactions, completed, verified, stamped, and filed, documenting the impossible resale of the same person over and over again. When the South Carolina Historical Society cataloged these records in 1923, they placed them under restricted access due to public interest concerns. A phrase typically reserved for sensitive materials involving political scandal or legal liability. Researchers who have attempted to view the documents have repeatedly been denied access or told that the records are not currently available for examination. A bureaucratic phrasing that hints at intentional concealment. The story begins in the spring of 1844, when a strange, persistent fog settled over Charleston. The mornings were slow and gray, the air damp, and the city's narrow streets felt muted under the weight of a mist that refused to lift until midday. Even under these uncanny conditions, the slave auctions on Chalmers Street continued their business with the mechanized regularity that had defined Charleston's economy for generations. Ryan's Mart, one of the most established auction houses, was known for its reputation among planters and traders. Its manager, Thomas Gadsden, a man of severe precision and measured demeanor, had gained a reputation for maintaining the most accurate records in the city. His ledgers were so reliable that they were often used in court disputes and estate settlements. On March 19th, through the fog that blanketed the city, arrived a man named Nathaniel Claiborne, a factor claiming to represent a dissolved Savannah estate. With him was a woman unlike the usual merchandise brought to Ryan's Mart, her posture upright, her expression calm, her demeanor suggesting education and discipline that were rare among enslaved individuals in that region. Claiborne presented paperwork documenting her legal status and instructed Gadsden to prepare her for auction under the name Deline. When Gadsden entered her information into the ledger inventory number 84,473, approximately 28 years old, literate, fluent in French, experienced in household management, musically trained, with a rare triangular birthmark, he had no notion that this single entry would become the first note in a sequence that would unravel the mental stability of some of Charleston's most powerful men. What should have been a routine transaction became the first domino in a chain of events that would unsettle the city's quiet elite. The auction proceeded, but the reaction among buyers was anything but normal. Colonel William Hainesworth, a prominent rice planter, opened bidding at an astonishing $800, an unusually high starting point for a woman, regardless of skill. Other elite planters quickly followed, raising the price far beyond typical economic sense. When the final bid struck at $2,800, more than 10 times a standard price, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Yet no one questioned the legitimacy of the sale. Wealth often manifested in displays of excess, and the elite had long grown used to competing in subtle shows of status. 3 days later, however, when the same factor returned with the same woman, carrying fresh documents authorizing a new sale, Gadsden began to sense the first tremor of something profoundly wrong, something that would eventually shake Charleston's aristocracy at its core. Gadsden had witnessed thousands of sales in his years at Ryan's Mart, but nothing in his experience prepared him for the moment Claiborne returned with the same woman just 72 hours after she had been transported to the Drayton plantation. The factor's calm insistence that the owner found her unsuitable felt rehearsed, almost performative. Yet the fresh documentation he carried bore the unmistakable signature and seal of Robert Drayton himself. Gadsden examined the papers repeatedly, searching for some flaw, but the signatures matched perfectly. The dates aligned with the transport logs, and the notary's seal was authentic. Still, an uneasiness stirred in him, something cold and instinctive, because the situation did not violate any law, yet defied every logical expectation. Property could be sold, certainly, but men of Drayton's wealth did not make impulsive purchases only to reverse them days later. The second auction drew even more attention than the first. Planters who had watched the initial sale with mild curiosity now observed with a keen, almost predatory interest. The bidding began at $1,000 and climbed with unnatural speed, as though each man in the room felt compelled not merely to buy, but to win. When Charles Coatsworth Pinckney purchased her for $3,200, Gadsden had the strange impression that the transaction was less a sale and more a ritual unfolding according to some unseen design. And yet, barely a week later, Claiborne returned again with familiar paperwork and the same woman standing behind him, calm, silent, unresisting, with that immaculate composure that seemed to unsettle the room more than any display of fear or distress would have. By the fourth sale in mid-April, a clear pattern had emerged. Each buyer was prestigious, wealthy, and socially rooted. Each paid more than the last, and each claimed vague unsuitability within days of purchase. Rumors began to circulate in Charleston's social circles, nothing explicit, only softened insinuations about strange events occurring on certain plantations, whispers exchanged in hallways of clubs and dining rooms, but never spoken in direct terms. Gadsden himself began documenting private notes in a second journal kept hidden in his desk, because the official ledgers required neutrality. Yet what he was witnessing defied any pretense of ordinary commerce. He noticed subtle but unmistakable changes in the men who returned their purchase. Hollow eyes, uncharacteristic hesitations, signs of fatigue or strain that had no clear cause. Some of these men withdrew from social engagements. Others dismissed longtime staff or altered routines in ways that suggested inner turmoil. By July, the resale price had escalated to $6,000, a sum that would have purchased multiple skilled male laborers, and still prominent planters competed with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The woman herself displayed no reaction to these escalating circumstances. She answered questions politely during inspections, but her eyes held a depth that made Gadsden increasingly uneasy, as if she saw through the pretenses of the system in ways the buyers could not bear to acknowledge. In late summer, as the sales continued, Gadsden began hearing more precise whispers from trusted associates. A banker confided that one buyer had suddenly requested an emergency loan despite considerable wealth. A lawyer hinted that another had dismissed household staff and retreated almost entirely from public life. Plantation factors spoke in lowered voices about sudden changes in behavior among men formerly known for stability and control. The pattern was too consistent to dismiss. Something was happening to these men, something that began the night they brought the woman into their homes and ended only when they returned her to Claiborne with those same carefully worded explanations. What remained unclear was what occurred in the interval between purchase and resale, what conversations or revelations could break men whose identities were built on power, certainty, and mastery. By the beginning of September, Gadsden felt the weight of a truth he could not yet articulate. These sales were not driven by commerce, nor by status, nor by desire alone. They were part of a deliberate sequence, and he himself, by documenting each transaction with perfect precision, was being made an unwilling participant in something far more calculated than an auction year's ledger could convey. By early September, Gadsden could no longer ignore the sense that he was caught inside a pattern whose logic remained hidden, but whose consequences were unmistakably real, and with mounting dread he hired a discreet investigator, former Constable David Brunson, to uncover what transpired after each sale. Brunson traveled quietly from plantation to plantation, speaking with overseers, household staff, and, when possible, the planters themselves under various pretexts. But the reports he returned with only deepened the mystery. No buyer kept the woman longer than a few days. Most sent her back within 48 hours, and every account hinted at a private encounter that left the men visibly altered. One overseer at the Hooger plantation reported that his employer emerged at dawn looking aged, shaken, and unwilling to discuss what had occurred behind closed doors. Another servant at the Gillard estate described hearing long, intense conversations through the study door. No shouting, no struggle, just a steady exchange of words until late into the night, after which Gillard locked himself away and immediately arranged her return to Charleston. In each case, the explanation for resale remained the same sterile phrase, unsuitable for household needs, but the strain in the men's eyes and the abrupt changes in their behavior suggested a deeper, more intimate devastation. Brunson also uncovered an unsettling absence of information surrounding Nathaniel Claiborne himself. No record of him in Savannah prior to the spring of 1844, no trace of family, business registration, or property. He appeared only where the sales occurred, vanishing again until another auction approached, as though his existence revolved entirely around the repeated resale of this one woman. Even the boarding house where he supposedly lodged rarely saw him enter or leave, despite his unfailing presence on auction days. More alarming still was Brunson's discovery regarding the woman's supposed origin. The Beaumont estate in Savannah, which Claiborne claimed had held her before dissolution, listed no record of any slave matching her description. The estate's final inventory included only 11 male field workers. Not a single woman was listed, let alone one possessing distinctive skills, literacy, or the triangular birthmark described so meticulously in Gadsden's ledger. It was as if she had materialized out of nowhere with documentation crafted perfectly enough to withstand legal scrutiny. The illusion of legitimacy held only because every piece of paper, while questionable in origin, bore the correct signatures, seals, and phrasing needed to satisfy South Carolina's rigid legal standards. When Claiborne appeared unannounced at the auction house late one evening, interrupting Gadsden and Brunson mid-conversation, his calm posture and quiet confidence filled the room with a tension that neither man could dispel. His presence felt less like the arrival of a businessman, and more like the emergence of someone who had been listening long before he knocked. Without accusation or haste, he confronted Gadsden about his inquiries and warned that the sales would continue exactly as intended, that 2 more transactions remained before the sequence reached its predetermined conclusion. The way he spoke, measured, certain, and unbothered by the impossibility of the situation, chilled Gadsden in a way no irregular paperwork ever had. The factor dismissed every implication of wrongdoing by referencing the law itself, reminding them that slavery's legal framework had always been flexible enough to classify human beings as property, and that his actions fell comfortably within boundaries shaped by centuries of exploitation. Yet beneath his smooth reassurances was an unmistakable suggestion. The pattern unfolding at Ryan's Mart was not accidental, not chaotic, but engineered with deliberate purpose. When pressed about the woman herself, who she was, where she came from, how she could know things no enslaved person should know, Claiborne's expression tightened just enough to hint that he understood more than he intended to reveal. And still, he offered nothing beyond the chilling implication that she was precisely what powerful men had always sought, something rare, valuable, and elevating to possess. The truth remained elusive, yet the consequences of each encounter were written plainly across the faces and lives of the men who tried to own her, leaving Gadsden with the sinking realization that whatever force drove these sales operated far beyond commerce, far beyond legality, and far beyond anything he could contain. The conversation with Claiborne left Gadsden and Brunson shaken, but it was what came afterward that finally stripped away any remaining illusion that the auctions were ordinary transactions governed by profit and prestige. In the weeks following their midnight confrontation, the sales continued with increasing intensity, and the buyers themselves, men once known for authority, confidence, and unshakable self-assurance, began to quietly unravel in ways that Charleston society noticed but could not explain. By October, when the 16th sale unfolded, the winning bidder was James Henry Hammond, a former governor and one of the most formidable political figures in South Carolina, a man whose influence extended from plantation wealth to legislative power. That someone of Hammond's stature would participate in the pattern at all was unsettling enough, but the tremor in the city grew stronger when he returned her after only 4 days, with paperwork bearing a signature so jagged and uneven it looked as though the hand that wrote it trembled uncontrollably. The margins were filled with frantic notes, disjointed calculations, crossed-out phrases, attempts to quantify something that had clearly overwhelmed him. When Claiborne delivered these documents to Gadsden, he maintained his usual calm, but even through that composed facade there appeared a faint crack, a subtle tension in his voice when he explained that the woman had spoken to Hammond about his personal debts, the illegal punishments he had carried out, the intimate scandals he had buried, and the ways his public moralizing collapsed under scrutiny. Each revelation had struck him not with the force of accusation, but with the precision of truth delivered by someone who understood the deepest fractures in a man's conscience. After Hammond's collapse and the increasingly frantic withdrawals of previous buyers, the 17th sale took on the weight of spectacle. Ryan's Mart filled not with the usual factors and overseers, but with Charleston's most powerful families, planters, political heirs, merchants whose wealth was interwoven with the entire institution of slavery. They arrived not to purchase, but to witness. The air crackled with an uneasy tension, a mix of fear and fascination, because even though none would publicly acknowledge the impossible rumors circulating through drawing rooms and private clubs, all had heard them, men speaking to the woman for a single night and emerging altered, shaken, or retreating from life altogether. When the bidding began, it escalated with startling speed, driven less by desire for labor and more by a desperate, prideful impulse to prove oneself stronger than the men who had faltered before. The final bidder, John Calhoun Preston, born into a lineage defined by political philosophy defending slavery, paid an astonishing $8,400, a sum no rational economic calculation could justify. His victory was greeted not with applause or murmurs of admiration, but with a heavy quiet that settled over the auction hall like an omen. And yet, 3 days later, Claiborne returned with the same blank expression, the same perfectly prepared documents authorizing resale, and the same woman standing behind him, unmoved, unaltered, as though the buyer's unraveling affected her no more than a change in weather. But this time, the ritual changed. For the first time since the pattern began, Claiborne stated that the next buyer could not be chosen from the elite planters or political heirs who had previously participated. Instead, he announced that the next sale had been reserved specifically for Gadsden himself. The words stunned him, snapping the final thread of distance he had tried to maintain between himself and the events unfolding in his auction house. He protested immediately, citing lack of capital, professional conflict, and complete unwillingness, but Claiborne countered calmly, revealing knowledge of Gadsden's private misconduct, alterations in documentation, concealed injuries, quiet compliance in separating families, all the small, devastating acts of cruelty Gadsden had rationalized as necessary for business. The quiet threat was unmistakable. Refusing to participate meant exposure, ruin, and perhaps imprisonment. For 3 torturous days Gadsden wrestled with his conscience, but in the end, inevitability closed around him like a tightening noose. He secured loans against his property, signed the purchase papers with trembling hands, and became, for the first time in his life, the legal owner of a slave. And when the woman finally sat across from him that evening, calm, poised, and with a gaze that seemed to see through every justification he had ever used, he understood that whatever had broken the other men was now coming for him, and there was no ledger in the world that could save him from what he was about to learn. The night Gadsden finally faced her alone inside his office marked the moment the entire facade of his professional detachment crumbled beyond repair, because unlike the wealthy planters who had purchased her before, he could no longer hide behind the illusion that he was merely facilitating transactions. Now he was the owner, the participant, the one who could no longer stand outside the system he had spent years enabling. She asked him to sit, her voice steady and composed, and began with questions so deceptively simple that for a moment he mistook them for polite conversation. How he had entered the auction business, whether he remembered his first sale, whether he kept mental notes of the individuals he had processed through his hands. But as the hours passed, the questions grew sharper, more specific, exposing the soft underbelly of every lie he had ever told himself. She spoke of a little girl named Sarah, 9 years old, whom he had sold despite the mother's desperate pleas, of an elderly man with a half-healed leg he had certified as sound to secure a higher price, of a woman who had attempted suicide the night before her sale, whose suffering he had scrubbed from the record to ensure the bidding wouldn't be affected. Every name she recited, hundreds of them, came with details Gadsden had forgotten, or pretended not to remember, and when he realized she knew the exact dates, buyers, prices, and fates of the people he had reduced to inventory numbers, the room seemed to tilt around him. She spoke calmly, not with accusation but with terrifying precision, as though she were holding up a mirror to a man who had never once dared to look at his own reflection. Gadsden tried to interrupt, tried to justify himself with the familiar excuses. He hadn't invented the system. He was just a middleman. If he didn't conduct the sales, someone else would. But she dismantled every argument with the same quiet clarity that had broken the previous buyers. She explained how systems of cruelty survive through the cooperation of ordinary men who convince themselves they bear no responsibility, how he had turned suffering into ledgers, families into inventory, human lives into columns of ink he balanced at the end of each day. She reminded him that the law he relied on for moral distance had also declared people property, babies commodities, and torture an acceptable management tool. By the time dawn light seeped through the windows, Gadsden was no longer the composed auctioneer who had once prided himself on his precision. He sat hollow-eyed, barely breathing, crushed under the unbearable weight of memory she had forced upon him. She told him he would authorize her resale, that he would feel relief at her departure, but that relief would sour into lifelong torment as the names she recited echoed through every moment of quiet he tried to claim in the years ahead. And she was right. By the time she walked out of his office, her footsteps soft and steady against the wooden floor, he felt something inside him fracture. When he completed the resale documents later that afternoon, his hands shook so violently he had to steady them on the table. Claiborne accepted the papers without triumph or mockery, as if this outcome had been inevitable all along. simply another step in a sequence that had been unfolding long before Gadsden understood. He was part of it. That night, unable to sleep, he looked over his ledgers, not with pride, but with horror, seeing not columns of commerce but a collection of confessions written in his own hand. Each entry was a wound, each line a testament to what he had helped maintain under the guise of professionalism. And as news spread quietly of how the previous buyers were withdrawing from society, altering their estates, questioning their beliefs, or collapsing under the psychological weight of what she had revealed to them, Gadsden realized he had joined them, not as an observer, not as a recorder, but as one more name in the chain of men undone by the truth a single woman had forced them to face. In the days that followed Gadsden's own unraveling, Charleston moved around him with its usual rhythm, the clatter of carriages on cobblestones, the distant hum of market stalls, the clipped, measured politeness of elite society, but none of it felt connected to him anymore, as though he had slipped sideways into a quieter, darker version of the city that only he could see. The names Deline had recited continued echoing through his mind, rising unbidden at the slightest trigger. A child's laughter in the street, a stray comment about plantation profits, the rustle of ledger pages when he opened his books in a vain attempt to resume his duties. He found that he could no longer look at the faces of the enslaved people brought to Ryan's Mart without seeing the ghosts of those he had already sold, each face merging with another, each voice blending with the chorus of memories she had forced upon him. At night, he woke gasping, convinced he heard her voice repeating the ages and fates of the people he had once processed as effortlessly as a merchant taking inventory. Brunson visited him twice, alarmed by the hollow look that had settled into Gadsden's eyes, but even the former constable, hardened by years of exposure to violence and cruelty, seemed shaken when he learned what she had done to Gadsden over the course of a single night. Brunson asked him bluntly whether he believed she was human in the ordinary sense, or something else entirely, but Gadsden could only answer that whatever her nature, the effect was irrefutably real. The spiral of collapse extended beyond himself. News trickled in about the other buyers, each story carrying the same eerie pattern. Drayton had abandoned his plantation and retreated into the city, avoiding all public gatherings. Pinckney had freed several enslaved individuals whose names, Gadsden suspected, were tied to the truths Deline had revealed to him. Huger had ceased speaking to most of his acquaintances, dismissing long-time overseers and retreating into a life of near seclusion. Even Claiborne's visits felt different now. Whenever he reappeared at the auction house, it seemed not as a mere factor overseeing a transaction, but as an agent completing a ritual, guiding each man toward a predetermined reckoning. When the 17th buyer, John Calhoun Preston, returned her with the same shaken urgency as the 16 before him, Gadsden felt little surprise, only a deepening dread, because now the pattern's conclusion loomed and whatever remained was meant for someone specific. 3 days passed before Claiborne returned again, this time with Deline beside him, her posture as steady as ever, but her eyes sharper, more focused, as though she had reached the final stage of whatever purpose had driven her through months of repeated sales. And in that moment, Gadsden realized with sickening clarity that the sequence was building toward one final buyer, someone whose role in the system ran deeper than wealth or plantation ownership. That individual appeared on the morning of the final auction, Langdon Sheaves Jr., the embodiment of Charleston aristocracy, a man raised in a family whose political theories had shaped pro-slavery ideology across the South. His entrance into the auction hall changed the air instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence, and even other members of the elite stepped aside with a respect bordering on unease. When the bidding began, it escalated with a kind of manic determination, but it was clear from the outset that Sheaves intended to claim her, not for labor or prestige, but for something more primal, a need to prove himself untouched by the downfall that had consumed the others. With each bid, he seemed to declare silently that he was stronger, more rational, more immune to whatever force had broken the men before him. When the final bid of $17,000 silenced the room, Gadsden felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The last stage of the pattern had begun, and Charleston's most unshakable defender of slavery was walking straight into the same abyss that had claimed 18 men already. Yet even then, Gadsden sensed something different this time, an anticipation in Claiborne's posture, an intensity in Deline's gaze, as though the 18th sale had been merely preparation, and the true conclusion of the sequence was finally about to unfold in a way none of them, not even Gadsden, had fully understood. What followed after Sheaves took her to his estate became the most whispered, most carefully avoided subject in Charleston's upper circles, because even among a society accustomed to secrets, nothing prepared them for the speed with which one of their most impenetrable pillars began to collapse. Within days, quiet rumors spread through the city, late-night conversations echoing through the halls of the Sheaves residence, servants reporting that their master spent entire nights in his study with the door shut, his voice rising and falling in low, frantic tones, while the woman's responses remained soft, steady, and devastatingly calm. By the fourth night, those servants noted that Sheaves emerged hollow-eyed and shaking, as if he had been forced to confront something so immense, so inescapable, that the foundations of his identity had cracked beneath it. When the urgent letter arrived at Ryan's Mart, written in a trembling, almost frantic hand, Gadsden recognized the writing not of a man requesting a routine resale, but of someone desperately trying to escape a force that had already burrowed too deeply into his conscience. Before Gadsden could even respond, word arrived that Sheaves had done what no one in his family's long, unbroken political lineage had ever done. He filed manumission papers, legally freeing the woman he had purchased at a price so extravagant it had emptied a portion of his fortune. The margins of the documents contained note, serratic, fragmented, and filled with references to names, dates, and cruelties the public record had never acknowledged. He wrote about the 73 individuals across his plantations, whose lives he had shaped through punishment, sale, or forced separation. He wrote about the philosophical arguments he had long used to justify slavery, arguments he had copied from his uncle, arguments that had shaped South Carolina policy, and how she had dismantled each one with precise logic and historical clarity until he could no longer hide behind the elegant rhetoric he had inherited. For a man like Sheaves, whose identity was built upon the belief that slavery was not merely profitable but morally defensible, such revelations did not just disrupt his world. They unmade him. And so, with a desperation bordering on redemption, he freed her and gave her funds to travel north, as though sending her away might also send away the unbearable understanding she had placed inside him. But the damage was irreversible. Charleston society watched in stunned confusion as Sheaves withdrew from political life, neglected business affairs, abandoned long-held social obligations, and expressed interest, unthinkable interest in their eyes, in supporting education for free black children. His family whispered privately that something had broken him, though none dared ask about the woman directly. Within weeks, his health deteriorated so rapidly that rumors spread he was afflicted with an unnamed wasting illness, though doctors, bewildered, found no disease. By the end of the year, he had aged a decade. By the next spring, he had become a ghost of the man who once dominated the Charleston political scene. His death in 1847, at just 44, was recorded as heart failure, but those who had heard fragments of his final days spoke of a man who had been hollowed out from within, consumed not by illness, but by the consequences of finally seeing the humanity of those he had spent his life justifying. As property, meanwhile, Deline vanished with the same silent precision with which she had entered Charleston's records. She boarded a northbound transport, her manumission papers and funds in hand, and after crossing into free territory she simply disappeared. No census entries, no property deeds, no marriage certificates, no trace. It was as if she had walked out of history the moment she completed whatever purpose had brought her into it. For Gadsden, this disappearance was almost more haunting than the months of impossible events themselves. He found himself searching for her name in Northern records during his later years, asking abolitionist societies if they had encountered a woman matching her description, but every inquiry ended the same way, with confusion, polite dismissal, or the quiet suggestion that such a woman could not be found because she had never been officially recorded anywhere. By the time Gadsden moved to Baltimore and attempted to document the events in writing, he understood that the truth of what had unfolded in Charleston would never be fully believed, not because it lacked evidence, but because it revealed too much about the fragility of the narratives that powerful men build to protect their own comfort. And the more he wrote, the more he sensed that the final chapter of this story, the 19th sale, the final unraveling, was not just the end of a sequence, but the beginning of a reckoning Charleston had spent decades refusing to confront. In the years that followed the disappearance of the woman, known in the ledgers as Deline, the shadow of those 8 months lingered over Thomas Gadsden like a stain that even time refused to fade. He tried again and again to capture the events in writing, to form a coherent narrative that might allow him to understand what had happened, not just to the other buyers but to himself. But every manuscript collapsed under the weight of the truth he was attempting to explain, each attempt ending abruptly as though his mind could travel only so far before recoiling. He carried the memory of that night with her like a wound that refused to close, and the faces she had forced him to remember became companions in his solitude. When he left Charleston for Baltimore years later, he carried with him only basic possessions, a few surviving ledgers, and the private journal where he had recorded the impossible pattern of sales. He told himself he would finish the account someday, that he owed it to history to reveal what had occurred, but deep down he knew the truth. Even if he wrote every detail, no one would believe it. How could they? Men of immense political and economic power, brought to their knees by a single woman whose origin could not be traced, a factor who appeared only for her sales and vanished into silence afterward, a sequence of transactions so precise and yet so impossible that it defied the logic upon which entire society rested. In 1863, bedridden with pneumonia as Union forces closed in on Charleston, Gadsden made one final attempt to set the story down. His hand trembled violently, the quill dragging uneven lines across the paper, as he wrote of the 19 men who had been forced to confront themselves in a way they never imagined possible. He described the silence that followed each sale, the way no one in Charleston dared to speak of what had happened despite knowing something was horribly wrong. He wrote that the education these men received, the brutal stripping away of their justifications, the forced recognition of the humanity they had crushed, was more destructive than any physical punishment could have been. And then the manuscript ended mid-sentence, just as all the others had, as though the truth itself resisted being captured on the page. After his death, the Charleston Historical Society eventually acquired his surviving papers. Archivists examined the ledgers and journals with uneasy curiosity, recognizing that the entries from 1844 presented a problem too dangerous, too inflammatory, to allow into public circulation. In 1891, under pressure from prominent families whose ancestors' names appeared repeatedly in those pages, the city quietly removed the most incriminating sheets, those detailing the 17 resale transactions, the soaring prices, the signatures of men who would later become legislators, governors, or celebrated figures in South Carolina's history. Those pages were sealed in a restricted archive, and the official records declared the gaps to be the result of clerical error. Over the decades, the incident faded from public memory and passed into the realm of whisper and speculation, a story told in hushed tones by archivists, hinted at by historians who noticed strange inconsistencies in plantation accounts, referenced obliquely in letters never intended for publication, and yet the truth remained preserved. In the missing pages, in the fragments of letters written by broken men, in the hollowed legacies of families who suddenly abandoned long-held political beliefs without explanation. As for the woman herself, history recorded nothing, and perhaps that was fitting. She appeared with no past, and she left with no trace, having delivered the precise reckoning required of those who believed themselves masters of a system built on human suffering. Her disappearance became part of the enigma, the final stroke in a story that seemed less like a historical incident and more like a carefully executed judgment. In the end, the only certainty left behind was this. For 8 months in 1844, Charleston's most powerful men were forced to confront the truth they had buried beneath wealth, law, and tradition, and the confrontation destroyed them. Whether she was flesh and blood, or something far older and far less bound by human laws, the effect was the same. Justice, long denied to thousands, had taken a form they could never have anticipated. And somewhere, locked away in sealed archives, untouched by time, lies the record of a woman who was sold 19 times yet owned by no one, not in life, not in memory, and not even in the history that tried so hard to erase her.